Her eyes remained strictly locked on the Persian rug, terrified to meet the cold gazes of the men deciding fates over rare filet mignon. Then, her heel caught on the thick carpet. The silver tray tipped. Amber liquid violently splashed across the polished leather shoes of the man seated at the head of the table. The entire room froze. A dozen hands instinctively slipped beneath tailored suit jackets. But Carter, the undisputed boss of the syndicate, didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for her wrist, pulling her trembling frame flush against his chest, and whispered into her ear, "Smile, and don't pull away. Tonight, you're my wife." The evening had begun like any other grueling Friday shift at L'Etoile, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a heavy brass door on a nameless street. Hannah adjusted the pristine white collar of her uniform, taking a deep, shuddering breath before pushing through the swinging doors of the kitchen. The air out here in the main dining room was entirely different. It was thick, practically humid, with the scent of white truffles, aged burgundy, and the unspoken weight of immense, unchecked power. She had worked here for 6 months, a grueling half-year of keeping her head down, her voice soft and her eyes blind to the faces of the patrons. The management had one golden rule for the waitstaff: you are the furniture. The furniture does not see, it does not hear, and it certainly does not speak unless spoken to. Hannah excelled at being furniture. She needed the tips. The exorbitant, carelessly discarded, hundreds left on silver platters, to keep her younger brother in his specialized physical therapy program. Survival was her only objective. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. The air pressure in the restaurant seemed to have plummeted, leaving a cold, static charge in its wake. The Obsidian Room, the private dining area fortified in the back, had been booked by a single party. Table 7 in the Obsidian. The maitre d' had hissed at her earlier, his usually composed face pale and damp with sweat. No eye contact. Fill the water, clear the plates, get out. If you breathe too loudly, you're fired. Now, holding a heavy silver tray loaded with 4 glasses of 40-year-old Macallan, Hannah approached the heavy oak doors of the private room. The 2 men standing guard outside were built like bank vaults, their eyes scanning her with the mechanical, detached precision of predators calculating the caloric value of prey. One of them pushed the door open for her, and the sound of low, rumbling voices spilled out. She stepped inside. The room was bathed in the dim golden light of crystal sconces. At a long mahogany table sat 5 men. 4 of them were older, their faces etched with the deep, craggy lines of a lifetime spent dealing in violence and deceit. But the man at the head of the table was different. Carter. Even without looking directly at him, Hannah could feel the gravitational pull of his presence. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke of old-world European tailoring. He possessed a terrifying stillness, a coiled energy that made the air around him feel dangerously combustible. He wasn't speaking, he was simply listening to the aggressive, gravelly voice of a man with a heavily scarred hand sitting to his right. Hannah approached the table, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved methodically, a ghost in the machine. She placed the first glass down, then the second. As she reached to place the third glass near the man with the scarred hand, she noticed something odd out of the corner of her eye. The scarred man was subtly sliding a small, folded piece of thick cardstock beneath the edge of his dinner plate. It was a minuscule movement, meant to be invisible, but the metallic clink of his heavy gold watch against the porcelain gave it away. Hannah's gaze flickered to the card for a fraction of a second. There was a smear of dark, rust-colored liquid on its edge. Blood. In that microsecond of distraction, the catastrophe occurred. She shifted her weight to reach across the wide table. Her sensible non-slip shoe caught the raised, embroidered edge of the antique Persian rug. The laws of physics took over with agonizing slowness. Her ankle rolled, her hip struck the edge of the mahogany table. The heavy silver tray tilted forward, slipping from the desperate grip of her damp fingers. The heavy crystal glass toppled. A collective, sharp intake of breath sucked all the oxygen from the room. The 40-year-old scotch rained down in a golden, sticky cascade, splashing directly over Carter's pristine white cuff and pooling onto his meticulously polished black leather Oxford shoes. The glass itself hit the floor with a deafening shatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Hannah froze. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The world seemed to screech to a sudden, violent halt. Slowly, terrifyingly, the heads of the four older men snapped toward her. The air in the room instantly turned lethal. She could hear the distinct, terrifying rustle of fabric, the sound of hands smoothly reaching into the interior pockets of their jackets. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She was looking at her own death, written in the cold, unblinking eyes of the men surrounding her. The man with the scarred hand actually half stood, his face twisting into a snarl of offended rage, a heavy silver pistol already glinting in the dim light as he drew it from his holster. "You clumsy, stupid," the scarred man began to spit. Then, the world shifted. Carter moved with a speed that defied his relaxed posture. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't shout. His large, warm hand shot out and clamped around Hannah's trembling wrist with the immovable force of a steel vice. With one smooth, incredibly powerful motion, he yanked her forward. Hannah stumbled, letting out a small, involuntary gasp as she was pulled around the corner of the table. She collided with the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. His arm wrapped around her waist, pinning her to his side, in an embrace that felt both like a shield and a trap. The scent of him enveloped her: sharp cedar, cold rain, and the faint metallic tang of something dangerous. He leaned down, his mouth grazing the sensitive skin just below her earlobe. "Smile," Carter whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a violent shiver down her spine. "And don't pull away. Tonight, you're my wife." The silence that followed Carter's whisper was heavier than lead. It pressed against Hannah's eardrums, thick and suffocating. Her brain short-circuited, desperately trying to process the absolute absurdity of the words she had just heard. "Wife." She looked up, her wide, terrified eyes meeting his for the first time. Carter's eyes were a piercing, bottomless black, completely devoid of warmth but burning with a fierce, calculated intensity. He wasn't looking at her with affection. He was looking at her the way a general looks at a crucial, unexpected piece on a chessboard. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle feathered beneath the sharp angle of his cheekbone. He squeezed her waist, a sharp, commanding pressure. Obey. Survival instinct, honed by years of scraping by on the razor's edge of poverty, kicked in. Hannah forced the muscles of her face to move. She stretched her lips over her teeth into a fragile, trembling approximation of a smile. She let her body go slack against his, burying her face into the lapel of his ruined, scotch-soaked jacket, as if seeking comfort rather than hiding her sheer terror. "Carter," the man with the scarred hand spoke, his voice dripping with dangerous incredulity. His gun was still visible, resting on the edge of the mahogany table. "What is the meaning of this? The girl insulted you. She insulted the table. Let me handle her." Carter's demeanor changed instantly. The subtle tension in his body vanished, replaced by an aura of absolute, terrifying command. He didn't raise his voice. But when he spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. "Julian," Carter said softly, his tone dangerously smooth. "Put the gun away." Julian hesitated, his eyes darting between Carter and Hannah. "She's a waitress, a clumsy nobody. She is wearing a uniform because she finds my world amusing. It is a game to her, Carter lied, his voice echoing with a dark amusement that chilled Hannah to the bone. His hand moved up to stroke Hannah's hair, a gesture that looked tender to the room, but his fingers gripped her scalp with enough force to keep her rigidly in place. We were married privately in Sicily 3 days ago. She insisted on finishing out her shift tonight. A display of independence. He looked around the table, his dark eyes locking onto each man individually, daring them to challenge the narrative. Any man who draws a weapon on my wife in my presence does not leave this room breathing. Is that understood, Julian? The threat wasn't loud or boisterous. It was stated as a simple, incontrovertible fact of physics. Like gravity, Julian's face flushed a deep, mottled purple, but he slowly, reluctantly slid the weapon back into his jacket. My apologies, Don Carter. I was unaware. See that you remain aware, Carter replied coldly. He looked down at Hannah. Are you all right, my love? The endearment felt like a knife slipping between her ribs. Yes, Hannah managed to whisper, her voice trembling so violently she barely recognized it. I'm so sorry about your suit. It's nothing, Carter said, his eyes flashing a warning. I think it is time we went home. Gentlemen, the terms are set. The shipment arrives on Tuesday. Do not disappoint me. Without waiting for a response, Carter turned, keeping his arm firmly clamped around Hannah's waist. He practically lifted her off the floor as he propelled her toward the heavy oak doors. They walked out of the obsidian room and into the main restaurant. The entire floor staff was frozen in place. The maitre d' stood near the bar, his mouth hanging open as he watched his quietest, most unremarkable waitress being escorted out by the most feared man in the city. Hannah kept her head down, her cheeks burning with a mixture of profound embarrassment and stark, unadulterated fear. She felt the heavy, incredulous stares of her co-workers burning into her back, branding her. They stepped out through the brass doors and into the biting chill of the autumn night. The city air smelled of exhaust and impending rain. A massive, sleek, black SUV was idling at the curb, its heavily tinted windows completely opaque. Two men in dark suits instantly materialized from the shadows. Opening the rear door, Carter didn't hesitate. He guided her into the cavernous back seat, sliding in right beside her. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in a soundproof, leather-scented vault. The SUV immediately pulled away from the curb, merging into the chaotic stream of city traffic. Hannah sat rigidly pressed against the far door, her knees tightly pressed together, her hands folded in her lap. She was trapped. She had survived the private dining room, but she had merely traded one execution chamber for another. The interior of the SUV was a masterclass in aggressive luxury. The soft ambient lighting illuminated the rich grain of the wood paneling and the supple black leather of the seats. It smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. The silence was absolute, save for the low, powerful thrum of the engine beneath them. Hannah stared out the window, watching the neon signs and streetlights bleed into long, vibrant streaks of color against the wet glass. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind. He said I was his wife. They believed him. Why did he say that? What does he want from me? She glanced at the door handle, wondering if it was locked, wondering if she could survive a tuck and roll at 40 miles an hour. Don't even think about it. Carter's voice shattered the silence, sharp and authoritative. Hannah jumped, her head snapping toward him. He was leaning back in his seat, his eyes closed, massaging the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger. He looked exhausted, the terrifying aura of the mob boss momentarily slipping to reveal the strained architecture of the man underneath. I wasn't, she stammered, hating how weak and breathy she sounded. Carter opened his eyes and turned his head to look at her. In the dim light, his features were carved in harsh shadows. You were calculating the trajectory of your exit. Let me save you the math. The child locks are engaged. Even if you got the door open, My men in the trailing vehicle would scoop you off the pavement before you stopped rolling. Hannah swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. What do you want from me? I didn't mean to spill the drink. It was an accident. I'll pay for the suit. I'll quit the restaurant. You'll never see me again. Carter let out a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh in a different lifetime. You think this is about the suit? He leaned forward, the sudden proximity stealing the air from her lungs. Listen to me very carefully. Hannah. She flinched. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. He probably knew everything about her. 50 seconds before you tripped, Carter continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. Julian, the man who drew the gun on you, slid a ledger card under his plate. You saw it. Hannah's breath hitched. I didn't see anything. Don't lie to me, Carter snapped, his eyes flashing dangerously. I watched your eyes track the movement. I watched you register the blood on the corner of the card. You saw it. And more importantly, Julian saw you see it. Hannah's heart began to hammer against her ribs again, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I swear, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a waitress, and Julian is a paranoid psychopath who ties up loose ends by severing them, Carter stated coldly. The moment you saw that card, you were a dead woman. He didn't draw his weapon because you spilled a drink. He drew his weapon because he was going to execute you right there in the room, claim you were an assassin making a move on me, and walk away clean. The horrifying logic of it hit Hannah like a physical blow. The sudden, violent rage from Julian. The speed with which he had drawn the gun. It hadn't been an overreaction to a clumsy waitress. It had been a calculated execution masked as an overreaction. Oh God, Hannah whispered, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled with hot, stinging tears. Oh my God, I claimed you as my wife because it is the only absolute law that animals like Julian respect, Carter explained, his tone utterly clinical, devoid of any comfort. Under syndicate law, the blood of a boss's wife is untouchable without a tribunal. By claiming you, I put a temporary shield over your head. I bought you time. Time for what? Hannah asked, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her pale cheek. Carter leaned back again, staring out the window into the rainy night. Time for me to figure out what to do with you. Because right now, you are the most dangerous liability in my life, and I am the only reason you are currently breathing. The SUV banked sharply, descending into a brightly lit underground parking garage. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered over Carter's face, highlighting the grim, unyielding set of his jaw. Hannah realized with sickening clarity that she hadn't been saved. She had simply been taken hostage by a different monster. The private elevator opened directly into the penthouse, and Hannah stepped out into a space that felt less like a home and more like a high-altitude fortress. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic, dizzying view of the city skyline, a sprawling grid of diamonds scattered across black velvet. The interior was vast and minimalist, decorated in stark contrasts of polished black marble, brushed steel, and stark white leather. It was immaculately clean, devoid of any personal touches, photographs, or warmth. It looked like a place where someone existed but did not live. Take your shoes off, Carter ordered as he strode past her, shrugging off his ruined suit jacket and tossing it carelessly onto a sleek glass chair. Hannah quickly complied, kicking off the sensible, black, non-slip work shoes that suddenly felt absurdly out of place in this temple of wealth. The marble floor was shockingly cold against her stockinged feet, sending a shiver up her legs. Follow me, he commanded, not looking back. She followed him down a long, echoing hallway, adorned with harsh, abstract paintings that looked like violent splashes of ink. He stopped before a heavy, featureless door and pushed it open, revealing a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment. A massive, low-profile bed sat in the center of the room, draped in dark silk. "This is your room," Carter said, finally turning to face her. "The bathroom is through there. The closets are stocked. My men will bring your personal effects from your apartment tomorrow." Panic spiked in her chest. "My apartment? You can't go to my apartment. Your brother is fine." Carter interrupted smoothly. "He is currently asleep at the Street Jude Care Facility. A guard has already been posted outside his door. He is safe, provided you do exactly as I say." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. He had already secured her only weakness. He had woven a net around her life in the span of an hour. "You're a monster," she whispered, the words slipping out before her brain could stop them. Carter didn't blink. He didn't show anger. He simply looked at her with that same terrifyingly calm, dead-eyed stare. "I am the monster keeping the other monsters from tearing you apart. Hannah, do not confuse the cage for the predator. Stay in this room. Lock the door if it makes you feel better. I do not care. Just do not try to leave." He turned and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him with a solid, definitive click. Hannah stood frozen in the center of the massive room for a long time. The silence of the penthouse was oppressive, heavy enough to crush bone. Finally, the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright began to recede, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion. She walked into the attached bathroom. It was a temple of white marble and gleaming chrome. She caught sight of herself in the massive, fogless mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes wide and haunted. The white collar of her waitress uniform was stained with a faint, amber splash of scotch. She stripped off the uniform, letting it fall to the floor in a crumpled heap, a symbol of a life she realized she could never go back to. She found a heavy, plush white bathrobe hanging behind the door and wrapped herself in it, tying the belt tightly around her waist like armor. She retreated into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the massive bed. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs. She was trapped in a golden cage, the captive wife of a mob boss, targeted by a psychopathic killer, and entirely cut off from her old world. The tears came then, silent and hot, soaking into the pristine silk sheets as she finally allowed herself to break down in the fortress of silk and steel. Hannah didn't sleep. She spent the night staring at the ceiling, jumping at every subtle shift in the building's air conditioning, every distant wail of a police siren far below. When the first gray, watery light of dawn began to bleed through the massive windows, she finally rose from the bed. She found clothes in the closet, not her clothes, but an array of neutral, incredibly expensive designer basics in exactly her size. It was a terrifying testament to Carter's resources and meticulous planning. She chose a simple black cashmere sweater and tailored gray trousers, feeling like she was putting on a costume for a role she didn't know how to play. Stepping out of the bedroom, she found the penthouse bathed in the cold, clinical light of morning. She followed the faint, rich scent of freshly ground coffee into the sprawling, state-of-the-art kitchen. Carter was there. He was sitting at the massive granite island, dressed in a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and a network of faint, jagged scars. He was drinking coffee from a minimalist black mug and reading a tablet. The sheer normalcy of the scene was jarring. He looked like a wealthy executive reviewing the morning market reports, not a ruthless syndicate boss who had kidnapped her the night before. He didn't look up as she entered, but he pushed a secondary, steaming mug of coffee across the smooth granite surface toward the empty stool next to him. "Black. 2 sugars," Carter said, his voice flat and conversational. "I assumed." Hannah approached the island cautiously, like a deer stepping into a clearing where it knows a wolf is waiting. She sat down on the very edge of the stool, wrapping her cold hands around the hot ceramic mug. She took a sip. It was perfect. "Thank you," she muttered softly. Carter finally looked up from his tablet. In the daylight, the shadows beneath his eyes were more pronounced. He looked dangerously tired. "We have a problem," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "Julian isn't backing down. He sent a message this morning. He wants proof." Hannah's hands tightened around the mug. "Proof of what?" "Proof that you are actually my wife, and not just a convenient excuse to protect a witness," Carter explained, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Julian is a dog who smells blood. He knows you saw the ledger card. He knows that card connects him to the embezzlement of syndicate funds. He needs you dead to cover his tracks. So, what happens now?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. "Do you just give me to him?" Carter's expression hardened, a flash of genuine, terrifying anger sparking in the depths of his eyes. "If I was going to give you to him, I wouldn't have ruined a $5,000 suit to save your life. I protect what is mine. And right now, to the rest of the world, you are mine." He tapped the screen of his tablet, pulling up a digital invitation embossed in gold and black. "Tonight is the annual syndicate gala. It is mandatory for all heads of the families. Julian will be there. The rest of the commission will be there. You and I are going to attend. You are going to play the role of the devoted, adoring new wife. We are going to put on a show so convincing that Julian will look like a paranoid fool if he tries to challenge my claim." Hannah stared at the digital invitation, the words blurring together. "I can't. I don't know how to be a mob wife. I'm a waitress. I'll mess it up. I'll do something wrong, and they'll know, and they'll kill me." Carter reached across the island. His large hand covered both of hers, his grip surprisingly warm, grounding her frantic energy. "You will not mess it up," Carter said softly, his voice dropping into that low, commanding register that demanded absolute obedience. "Because if you mess it up, Julian puts a bullet in your head, and then he puts one in your brother's head just to be thorough. You will smile. You will hold my arm. You will speak only when spoken to, and you will agree with everything I say. Do you understand?" The mention of her brother extinguished her panic, replacing it with a cold, desperate resolve. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. "I understand." "Good," Carter said, withdrawing his hand. "The dressmakers arrive in 1 hour. Prepare yourself." The transformation took 6 excruciating hours. A small army of silent, intensely focused women descended upon the penthouse. They scrubbed Hannah, polished her, and molded her into something entirely foreign. They pulled her hair into a severe, elegant chignon that pulled at her scalp, painted her face with a heavy, flawless mask of cosmetics that made her look 10 years older and infinitely colder, and finally they brought out the dress. It was a masterpiece of dark emerald silk that clung to every curve of her body like liquid glass, with a plunging neckline and a slit that rode dangerously high up her thigh. It was a dress designed for a woman who commanded attention, a woman who understood power. Hannah felt entirely exposed and entirely trapped within it. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, the sun had set, and the city was once again a sea of glittering lights. Carter was waiting in the living room, dressed in a flawless black tuxedo that emphasized the broad, predatory lines of his shoulders. He turned as she entered. For a long, silent moment, he just looked at her. His dark eyes swept over her from the diamond chandelier earrings, brushing her collarbones to the precarious, strappy heels on her feet. A strange, unreadable emotion flickered briefly across his face before his features settled back into their usual, impenetrable mask. "You look," Carter started, then paused, his jaw tightening. "Adequate. Let's go." The drive to the gala was fraught with a tense, vibrating silence. Carter sat rigidly, staring straight ahead, occasionally checking a sleek silver pocket watch. Hannah focused on breathing, trying to calm the nauseating flutter of panic in her stomach. "Remember the rules," Carter said, as the SUV pulled up to the grand, sweeping entrance of the Continental Hotel. "Keep your voice low. Do not engage in extended conversations. If someone asks about our wedding, tell them it was sudden, passionate, and private in Palermo. If Julian approaches you, do not break eye contact, but do not challenge him. Let me handle him. I remember," Hannah whispered, her hands gripping her small, jewel-encrusted clutch so tightly her knuckles were white. "And Hannah?" Carter added, turning his head to look at her as the driver opened the door. His voice was suddenly softer, almost hesitant. "Trust me." Before she could process the request, he stepped out of the car and offered his hand. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, anchoring her as she stepped out into the flashing barrage of paparazzi cameras and the blinding glare of the red carpet. The ballroom was a sprawling cavern of opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, fracturing light over a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and the underlying metallic tang of danger. Every face in the room turned toward them as they entered. Hannah felt a physical weight press down on her chest. These were not normal people. These were the architects of the city's underworld, killers, extortionists, and thieves masquerading in high society. And they were all looking at her. Carter's hand slid from hers, moving up to rest heavily on the bare skin of her lower back. It was a possessive, territorial gesture. He guided her through the crowd, nodding to various men, offering tight, mirthless smiles. "Smile, my love," he murmured into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "They can smell fear." Hannah forced her lips to curve, her eyes scanning the crowd. She played the part perfectly. She nodded when introduced, offered polite, vacant smiles, and kept her body pressed subtly against Carter's side. She was a beautiful, silent prop. Then, the crowd parted, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian was walking toward them. He was wearing a sharp, burgundy tuxedo, the scarred hand clutching a crystal glass of champagne. His eyes were locked dead onto Hannah, shining with a malicious, predatory glee. "Carter," Julian purred as he stopped in front of them, his voice carrying over the low hum of the ballroom. "And the lovely new bride. You look entirely different without the apron." Hannah's breath hitched, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, keeping her chin raised, just as Carter had instructed. "Julian," Carter replied, his voice a smooth, dangerous rumble. His hand tightened on Hannah's back. "A pleasure, as always." "I must say, Carter, your sudden nuptials took us all by surprise," Julian continued, his eyes trailing brazenly down Hannah's body. "A waitress from L'Etoile, a modern-day Cinderella story. Tell me, my dear, what is it like to marry into royalty?" "It is overwhelming," Hannah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Carter is a very commanding presence." Julian laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, I'm sure he is. I'm sure he commands many things. But tell me, do you ever miss your old life? Do you ever miss serving things? Cleaning up messes?" He took a step closer, invading her personal space. Hannah could smell the alcohol on his breath, mixed with something distinctly metallic and foul. "Because sometimes," Julian whispered, his eyes narrowing into cold slits, "messes are very difficult to clean up. Sometimes they leave stains." It was a direct threat, He was talking about the blood on the ledger card. Before Hannah could respond, Carter moved. He didn't step between them. He simply shifted his weight, his broad shoulder subtly blocking Julian's path. "My wife doesn't clean up messes anymore, Julian," Carter said, his voice dropping to a whisper so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. "She leaves that to me, and you know how thoroughly I sanitize my territory." The two men stared at each other, a silent, violent war of wills being waged in the middle of a crowded ballroom. The air crackled with lethal tension. Then Julian smiled, a thin, ugly stretching of his lips. He raised his champagne glass in a mock toast. "To a long and healthy marriage, Carter. May neither of you meet a sudden end." He turned and melted back into the crowd. Hannah let out a long, shaky breath, her knees trembling so badly she leaned heavily against Carter to stay upright. "He knows," she whispered frantically. "He knows everything." "I know," Carter replied, his eyes scanning the room with heightened vigilance. "Stay close to me. Do not let go of my arm." But as Hannah looked past Carter's shoulder, her blood turned to ice. Standing near the massive service doors at the back of the ballroom, dressed in the uniform of a catering waiter, was a man. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking directly at her, and slowly, deliberately, he reached inside his jacket. "Carter!" Hannah gasped, her fingers digging painfully into the rigid muscle of his forearm. "Carter!" "Look!" Carter didn't turn his head immediately. He maintained his composed, arrogant facade, but his body tensed into a coil of solid steel. "Where?" he murmured, his lips barely moving. "By the service doors." "The waiter." "He's reaching inside his coat." In a fraction of a second, Carter processed the threat. He didn't look back. He looked forward, his eyes calculating the distance to the nearest exit, the density of the crowd, the structural cover of the marble pillars. "Walk," Carter commanded, his voice a low, urgent hum. "Do not run. Keep your face completely blank. We are going toward the conservatory on the left." He gripped her elbow, propelling her forward with a forceful, guided momentum. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The beautiful, opulent ballroom suddenly morphed into a gauntlet. The glittering chandeliers looked like falling debris waiting to happen. The smiling, heavily perfumed guests were obstacles. The lush orchestral music was a deafening roar drowning out her thoughts. She kept her eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany doors of the conservatory ahead of them. Left foot, right foot. Don't trip in the heels. Don't look back. They were halfway across the room when the first pop echoed over the music. It sounded small, muffled like a champagne cork opening poorly. But the crystal vase on the pedestal 2 feet to Hannah's right instantly exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Screams erupted. The delicate facade of the high society gala shattered instantly, revealing the violent, chaotic truth underneath. The crowd surged, a panicked tidal wave of silk, diamonds, and terror. "Down!" Carter roared, his voice cutting through the panic. He didn't wait for her to comply. He threw his massive weight against her, tackling her to the polished marble floor. Hannah hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs in a painful rush. The heavy silk of her dress pooled around her as Carter covered her body completely with his own, pressing her face into the cold stone. More muffled pops followed, accompanied by the distinct, terrifying sounds of bullets tearing through fabric, shattering glass, and sinking into the plaster walls. "Crawl!" Carter shouted directly into her ear, the heat of his breath a stark contrast to the cold floor. Toward the doors. Now, Hannah scrambled blindly, her manicured fingernails scraping uselessly against the marble. She tore the restrictive slit of her dress higher, desperate for mobility. She scrambled like an animal, the elegant facade entirely forgotten in the raw, primal urge to survive. Carter moved with her, a protective, mobile shield of muscle and bone. keeping his body positioned between her and the direction of the gunfire. They reached the heavy wooden doors of the conservatory. Carter kicked one open with a savage thrust of his boot. He grabbed Hannah by the collar of her dress and dragged her inside, slamming the door shut and sliding the heavy brass deadbolt into place. The conservatory was a dark, humid jungle of exotic plants and towering glass walls overlooking the city. It offered no real cover, only shadows. Carter pulled her behind a massive, thick-trunked banyan tree in a concrete planter. He drew a sleek, matte black handgun from a holster hidden beneath his tuxedo jacket, holding it with a steady, professional grip. He looked down at Hannah. She was trembling violently, her breathing ragged and shallow, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands moving quickly over her arms, her ribs, checking for blood. "No," she stammered, shaking her head frantically. "I don't think so." "Carter, they're going to kill us." Julian sent him. "He's going to kill us." Carter stopped checking her for wounds. He leaned back against the concrete planter, his eyes darting toward the locked wooden doors. The chaotic screaming from the ballroom was muffled but clear. He looked at Hannah, the hard, impenetrable mask of the Mafia boss slowly fracturing, revealing a raw, desperate exhaustion underneath. "Julian didn't send him to kill us, Hannah," Carter said softly, his voice devoid of its usual terrifying command. It sounded surprisingly human. "He sent him to kill you." "I know," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Because of the card. Because I saw the blood." "No," Carter said, reaching out to gently pull her hands away from her face. His dark eyes held hers, with an intensity that burned through her panic. "That's not why." Hannah stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Carter took a deep, shuddering breath, the silence in the humid conservatory heavy with the weight of an impending confession. "The card you saw didn't have blood on it from a hit," Carter said, his words measured, precise. "It had a chemical tracker dye on it. I put it there." Hannah's mind stalled. She couldn't process the words. You put it there?" "Yes," Carter said, his jaw clenching. He looked away for a moment, staring into the dark foliage. "I'm not who you think I am, Hannah. I'm not the head of this syndicate. Not truly." He looked back at her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate honesty. "My real name is Agent Thomas Carter. I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have been deep undercover in this syndicate for 3 years, trying to dismantle it from the inside. And Julian's ledger was the final piece of evidence I needed to bring the entire empire down." The revelation hung in the humid air of the conservatory, heavier than the scent of the exotic orchids. Hannah stared at him, her brain frantically trying to reconcile the ruthless, terrifying mob boss who had kidnapped her with the man sitting before her claiming to be a federal agent. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Your FBI?" she whispered, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. "But the things you've done, the way they look at you, the power, undercover work isn't acting, Hannah," Carter said bitterly, his eyes dark with the ghosts of his actions. "It's becoming the monster, so you can get close enough to cut off its head. You have to earn their respect, which means you have to play their game. I've done things I'll never be able to wash off my hands, but I was 3 days away from ending it. 3 days from handing Julian and the rest of the commission over to the feds." "Then why did you pull me into it?" Hannah cried out, her fear morphing into a sudden, blinding anger. "Why did you drag me into this nightmare? If you're the good guy, why didn't you just let me go?" Carter closed his eyes for a brief, pained second. "Because you wiped the menu." "What menu?" "Before you brought the drinks to the obsidian room," Carter explained, speaking rapidly, his eyes constantly scanning the dark glass walls. You cleared table 4 in the main dining area. A man sat there briefly, drank a water, left a menu, and walked out. That man was my informant. He slipped a micro SD card containing Julian's offshore bank routing numbers beneath the fold of the menu. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She remembered. She remembered wiping the table, gathering the menus. Julian's men spotted the informant leaving. Carter continued grimly. They knew a drop had been made. Julian came into the obsidian room, knowing the evidence was in the restaurant. When you walked in with the drinks, Julian recognized you as the waitress who cleared table 4. He wasn't sliding a card under his plate. He was drawing his weapon beneath the table. He was going to execute you to ensure you hadn't seen the drive, and then his men were going to tear the restaurant apart looking for it. The pieces fell into place with a sickening, terrifying clarity. The sudden hostility, the instantaneous draw of the weapon. When you tripped, Carter said softly, his gaze locked on her. It gave me the half-second I needed to intervene without blowing my cover. If I had drawn my weapon on him to protect a waitress, my cover was blown. The operation was dead, and we both died in that room. The only way to save your life without destroying a 3-year operation was to claim you under syndicate law, to make you untouchable. Hannah felt the anger drain out of her, replaced by a profound, hollow shock. So, you ruined your suit on purpose? I shifted my leg when the tray fell, Carter admitted, the ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. I needed a distraction. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the conservatory rattled violently. Someone was throwing their weight against them. Carter's demeanor instantly switched back from the burdened agent to the lethal operative. He raised the gun, aiming it squarely at the center of the doors. Get behind the planter. Stay low, he hissed. Carter, Hannah whispered frantically. What do we do? We can't stay here. The glass walls. We're sitting ducks. I know, Carter said, his eyes scanning the glass. We're not staying. He pointed his weapon toward the towering reinforced glass pane facing the street below. Without hesitation, he fired 3 rapid shots in a tight circular pattern into the center of the glass. The deafening roar of the gun in the enclosed space made Hannah's ears ring violently. The thick glass didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed, creating a massive, frosted fault line in the center of the pane. Carter rushed forward, entirely ignoring the frantic pounding on the wooden doors behind them. He grabbed a heavy wrought-iron patio chair and swung it with all his brutal, coiled strength against the weakened center of the glass. The pane exploded outward, sending a cascade of jagged crystal raining down into the rainy night air. The sudden rush of cold wind and city noise tore through the humid conservatory. We are 3 stories up, Carter yelled over the wind, grabbing Hannah by the arm and pulling her toward the gaping hole. There is a canvas awning over the patio of the restaurant below us. We have to jump. Hannah looked out into the dizzying, rain-slicked abyss. Are you insane? I'm wearing a silk dress and heels. I'll break my neck. Take the heels off! Carter roared, his eyes wild. The heavy brass deadbolt on the conservatory door began to give way with a sickening crunch. Hannah, I swear to God, I will catch you. But we have to jump now. She kicked off the shoes. She looked at Carter. This terrifying, complex man who had kidnapped her, lied to her, and saved her life twice. If I die, I'm going to haunt you. She screamed. Over the wind, Carter grabbed her tightly around the waist, pulling her flush against his chest, just as he had in the restaurant. I'd expect nothing less, my wife, he said, and together they stepped out into the empty air. The fall was a terrifying, breathless eternity compressed into 2 seconds. The rushing wind whipped the breath from Hannah's lungs. Then they hit, The thick, industrial canvas of the restaurant awning bowed deeply beneath their combined weight, snapping taut with a loud crack like a gunshot. It didn't break, but the brutal deceleration forced all the air from Hannah's body. They bounced, tumbling in a tangle of limbs and torn silk, rolling toward the edge. Carter's arm shot out, his hand gripping the heavy metal strut of the awning structure, anchoring them just inches from a secondary fall to the concrete patio below. They lay there in the pouring rain, gasping for air, the cold water instantly soaking through Carter's tuxedo and Hannah's ruined dress. Above them, the silhouettes of armed men appeared in the shattered window of the conservatory, firing wildly into the dark, but the rain and shadows hid them. "Move," Carter rasped, struggling to his feet on the precarious slanted canvas. "We need to get to the street." He helped Hannah down the structural bracing to the empty patio below. They ran through the dark, winding alleyways behind the hotel, slipping on the wet cobblestones, fueled purely by adrenaline and the sheer desperate terror of pursuit. 10 minutes later, they collapsed into the back of a rusted, nondescript sedan parked on a forgotten side street. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious SUV, smelling of old fast food and damp fabric. Carter keyed the ignition, the engine sputtering to life, and slammed the car into gear. He drove erratically, taking sharp turns and doubling back to ensure they weren't followed, until they finally pulled into the dark, concrete belly of an abandoned parking structure near the docks. He cut the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of rain drumming against the metal roof of the car and their own ragged breathing. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, shivering violently, her beautiful dress torn and soaked, her feet bruised and scraped. She looked at Carter. He looked worse. He had a deep gash on his forehead from the fall, blood mingling with the rain, washing down his face. He pulled a secure, encrypted satellite phone from a hidden compartment under the dashboard and rapidly punched in a number. "It's Carter," he said into the receiver, his voice tight. "Code black. Cover is blown." Julian made a move at the gala. "I need an extraction team. At Extraction Point Echo, in 20 minutes. I have a civilian with me." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. His jaw tightened. "No, I don't have the ledger," Carter said through gritted teeth. "The op went south before I could secure it from Julian's penthouse safe. I know without the ledger we can't hold them." "Understood." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the dashboard with a frustrated, defeated sigh. He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. "What happened?" Hannah asked softly, her voice trembling. "My handlers," Carter said wearily. "They're pulling me out. The operation is burned. But because I didn't get Julian's ledger tonight, he walks. The commission walks. We spent 3 years building this case, and they are going to get away with everything." He turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes filled with a profound, quiet regret. "An extraction team is coming. They will take you to a safe house. They will put you and your brother into witness protection. You'll get new names, a new city. You'll be safe, Hannah. It's over." Hannah stared at the rain sliding down the windshield. Witness protection. A new life. It was everything she had ever wanted, an escape from the crushing poverty, the fear, the struggle. But then she thought about the men in the obsidian room. She thought about Julian's cruel, scarred hand, and the casual, terrifying way he had reached for his gun to execute a waitress just to cover his tracks. She thought about the hundreds of other innocent people those men would hurt if they remained in power, and she thought about the man sitting next to her, a man who had lived in darkness for 3 years, sacrificing his soul to stop them, only to fail at the finish line because he chose to save her life instead of securing his evidence. "Where is the ledger?" Hannah asked suddenly, her voice dropping the tremor. Carter opened his eyes, frowning at her. "What?" You said Julian has it in his penthouse safe. Where is his penthouse? Hannah. Stop, Carter warned, sitting up straight. The operation is over. The team is coming. Carter. Listen to me, Hannah said, turning in her seat to face him fully. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity she had never felt before. Julian doesn't know you're a cop. He thinks you're a rival boss who narrowly survived an assassination attempt by an unknown hitman at the gala. Carter's eyes narrowed as his operational mind caught up with her logic. True, the shooter was hired anonymously, probably through a proxy. Julian can play dumb. Exactly, Hannah pressed. Which means Julian isn't expecting you to come for him tonight. He's expecting you to be hiding, licking your wounds. But more importantly, she swallowed hard, taking a leap of faith. Julian believes I am your wife. He believes I am the new, terrified, obedient trophy. Carter stared at her, horrified realization dawning on his face. No, absolutely not. I am not letting you do this. You can't get into his penthouse, Hannah argued fiercely, ignoring his objection. His security will shoot you on sight because you're a rival boss, but they won't shoot your frantic, terrified new wife begging for sanctuary because she got separated from you in the chaos and has nowhere else to run. It's suicide, Carter snapped, gripping the steering wheel. Julian is a psychopath. He's an arrogant psychopath, Hannah corrected, her eyes burning with resolve. He will want to gloat. He will bring me in, and he will keep me alive long enough to use me as leverage against you. That gets me in the door. That gets me near his safe. Carter stared at the quiet, unassuming waitress who had trembled at the sound of a clinking glass just 24 hours ago. The transformation was staggering. You don't know how to crack a safe, he said weakly, his resistance crumbling against the tactical brilliance of her desperate plan. Hannah reached over, taking his large, scarred hand in her small, cold ones. No, she said softly, but you're going to teach me. Right now. We have 15 minutes before your extraction team arrives. Show me. The elevator doors opened directly into Julian's penthouse. Still in her ruined emerald dress and barefoot, Hannah stumbled out into the lobby. Two massive guards immediately reached for their holstered weapons. Don't shoot! Hannah screamed, dropping to her knees on the plush carpet. Please, I need Julian. I'm Carter's wife. The heavy double doors swung open. Julian stood there, a fresh cigar clamped in his teeth, a cruel smile spreading across his scarred face. Look what the storm washed up, he purred, dragging her up by the arm and pulling her inside. He shoved her into a leather chair opposite his massive mahogany desk. Behind it, partially hidden by a painting, was the digital keypad of the wall safe. So, Carter abandoned you? Julian sighed, pouring a scotch. He casually laid his heavy silver pistol on the desk. You're a beautiful piece of leverage, my dear. We'll wait and see how desperate he is to get you back before I... The reinforced glass window behind Julian exploded inward. Glass shrapnel tore through the room like a blizzard as Julian was blasted forward over his desk. Through the smoke and raining debris, figures clad in black tactical gear swung into the room on ropes. FBI! Nobody move! A voice roared. Julian scrambled blindly, lunging for the silver pistol. Before his fingers could graze the metal, a heavy combat boot slammed down, crushing his scarred hand against the mahogany with a sickening crunch. Carter stood over him in full tactical gear. It's over, Julian, Carter said, his voice ringing with the cold, hard authority of federal law. Hannah didn't wait. She scrambled behind the desk to the safe, her hands shaking violently as she punched in the override code Carter had taught her. 7299. Enter. The steel door popped open with a hiss. She reached in and pulled out the black leather ledger, clutching it to her chest as if it were a shield. Carter pulled down his tactical mask. He stepped over Julian's groaning form, gently took the ledger from her hands, and pulled her into a tight, desperate embrace. The relief in his eyes was so profound it made Hannah's breath hitch. "You actually did it," he whispered into her hair. Hannah closed her eyes, resting her head against the cold, tactical armor of his chest, listening to the steady, strong beating of his true heart. "I told you," she whispered back. "I'm not just a waitress. In the end,